So, Richard Dawkins is probably the world's most famous atheist and evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book called The Greatest Show on Earth, where he lays out the evidence for evolution, or what he thinks is the evidence. And in chapter 10 of that book, he says that similarities between different kinds of animals is the best evidence, he thinks, for evolution. You know, and many people, they might think of apes and humans and stuff, and I want to do a whole video on that at a different time. But dealing with this issue of similarities, I don't think it's a good argument for a lot of reasons, but even evolutionary scientists themselves recognize that you can have an animal that's very similar to another animal and them not be related. And actually, this causes a lot of problems when they're trying to develop a coherent picture of what happened. Paleontologist Neil Shubin,
in the journal Nature, he writes, "Fossil discoveries can muddle our attempts to construct simple evolutionary trees. Fossils from key periods are often not intermediates, but rather hodgepodges of defining features of many different groups. Generally, it seems that major groups are not assembled in a simple linear or progressive manner. New features are often cut and pasted on different groups at different times. This poses a chicken and egg problem for paleontologists. If independent evolution of key characters is common, how is phylogeny to be recognized?" And a paper from the Journal of Mammalian Evolution says that these disagreements lie at the core of most conflicting phylogenetic hypotheses. A study in the journal Paleontology found that the neck region of Tiktaalik is very similar to that of Mandagiria or Mandagiria. And then what about the Chalicotherium? Paleontologist Michael Benton writes, "The Chalicotherium looks like an imaginary mammal composed of the rear parts of a sloth, the arms of a gorilla, and a horse's head. But it was real enough, as shown by numerous complete fossil skeletons from the Miocene period of Europe and Africa, and also by relatives from North America and Asia."
think about the Australian marsupials. You have counterparts of many of them in North American placental mammals. You know, there's a marsupial and placental version of mice, rabbits, moles, badgers, saber-toothed tigers, and wolves. The wolves, the Tasmanian marsupial wolf and the North American wolf, have a lot of similarities, especially in their jaw. But evolutionary scientists don't believe they're similar because they're closely related. They believe that before there was a wolf, two different creatures, one in North America, one in Australia, and because of similar environmental conditions, independently turned out similar. They call this convergent evolution, when two things converge on the same design by accident, not because that they were closely related. However, there's a lot of problems with this.
Biologist Jonathan Wells and mathematician William Dembski write, "There are two problems with this line of reasoning. One, the evidence doesn't support the assumption that environmental demands in the evolutionary history of both wolves were similar. And two, there's no reason to think that even with similar environmental demands, two separately evolving organisms should evolve not just a single similar feature, but rather a whole suite of similar features that match up point for point. But the coincidences don't stop there. Besides marsupial wolves, Australia is also home to a host of other marsupial lookalikes: marsupial cats, squirrels, groundhogs, anteaters, moles, and mice. Thus, not only were individual organisms on different continents independently evolving whole suites of similar features, but the two entire subclasses of marsupial and placental mammals on two different continents were independently evolving the same morphological types, each sharing whole suites of similar features. Without some form of design or teleological guidance, convergent evolution requires a piling of coincidences on coincidences that strains credulity.
The panda has a good story too. Both the giant panda and the red panda live in bamboo forests in China. And for a long time, scientists were pretty evenly split on them both being bears or them both being raccoons. Until 1964, when Dwight Davis published the definitive discussion on the matter. And he decided that the panda bear was not a raccoon but a bear, and the red panda was a raccoon. And for the most part, biologists now agree with him. But it's interesting to notice all of the different similarities between the giant panda and the red panda. For example, their skull shape. You know, the giant pandas is a lot more similar to the red pandas than to, say, a polar bear. The stomach and liver between the two pandas is more similar than theirs are to bears. Their thumb is also another good example. It's a unique feature, and you don't find it on other bears or other raccoons, but you do find it on these two pandas. They have a lot of similar characteristics that on the face of it would suggest that they're related, so it's no surprise that for a long time scientists thought they were. But now scientists don't believe that they are related at all. And the thumb, its stomach, its liver, and its skull, those are just coincidence. And they have nothing to do with ancestry.
You know, look at seals and sea lions. Very similar, but not believed to be closely related. Science writer and evolutionist Roger Lewin writes, similarity of structure does not necessarily imply an identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, and a porpoise, which is a mammal, look similar. You could even throw in, a reptile, the ichthyosaur, and you can see that dolphins, sharks, ichthyosaurs, and a lot of fish look very similar. And so in this case, scientists ignored the similarities in the dorsal fins and focused on other things like fur, mammary glands, and other stuff. There's also the birds, bats, flying reptiles like pterosaurs, and flying insects. The platypus is an egg-laying, venomous, duck-billed, beaver-tailed, otter-footed, semi-aquatic mammal, but nobody believes that it evolved from any of those things or that it is evolving into any of those things. And the bill shape that you also see on dinosaurs, and no one thinks the platypus and dinosaurs are closely related. And even simple things like the horns and frills on chameleons and ceratopsid dinosaurs like the triceratops, rhinos, and even certain large horned beetles.
Now, another problem with using similar structures as evidence for evolution is how these structures develop in the first place. Evolutionary scientists, for a long time, expected that similar structures on creatures they thought were related, they expected the same kind of genes in those animals to produce these similar structures. They also expected that these structures would develop in the same kind of way, follow the same kind of path and do the same kind of thing. But it turns out both of those assumptions were later shown to be wrong, and that similar structures on creatures they believed were closely related turn out to not come from the same kind of genes or develop in the same kind of way for the most part.
Gavin de Beer was a pretty well-known evolutionary embryologist, and he wrote, because homology, that is the similarities, implies community of descent from a common ancestor, it might be thought that genetics would provide the key to the problem of homology. This is where the worst shock of all is encountered, because characters controlled by identical genes are not necessarily homologous, and homologous structures need not be controlled by identical genes. What mechanism can it be that results in the production of homologous organs, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes? I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered. And concerning the way that these similar structures develop, evolutionary biologist Rudolf Raff writes, homologous features in two related organisms should arise by similar developmental processes, but features that we regard as homologous from morphological and phylogenetic criteria can arise in different ways in development. And embryologist Perry Allbirch says that it is the rule rather than the exception that homologous structures form from distinctly dissimilar initial states.